Hi, it's Mary Ellen with IT in Canada, and I'm here today speaking with John Shaw, who's the CIO for Mainstream Renewables at the IVI Winter Session Summit held at Compugen headquarters. John, I see from your website that Mainstream Renewables is active in Canada, primarily in the development of wind farms in the western provinces. What's your experience been like working in renewables in a fossil fuel centre like Alberta?
Well, our business is all about developing, constructing and operating wind and solar plant across the globe. And in Canada, our offices are based in Mississauga, led by Shara Zulerons. In Alberta in particular, we have a very strong leader there, Claude Mindorf, who works with Shara. And Claude knows the local market and knows the landowners. Ultimately, our business is all about thinking globally but acting locally. And wherever we operate in 8 countries across the globe, we follow that principle.
Okay, so you're able to work on renewables in a province where fossil fuels are really central to the economy through local connections.
Absolutely. Working directly with the local communities, the local landowners, and deriving the business value locally, performing the environmental impact assessment, looking at the power purchase agreement options, and building the project proposition directly with the local community.
Okay. You mentioned this morning in your formal presentation that you had a few more projects in Canada in the pipeline, and I'm specifically interested in any plans you might have for Ontario. As you know, Ontario is considered a North American leader in renewable energy due to our AMI programs, but also due to the feed-in tariff that offers subsidies for renewable generation. So do you have any plans for Ontario?
Yeah, Shara Zulerons and her team are working through a set of solar projects now. Ontario is really a pace setter in encouraging the use of solar power, and we have a set of projects tracking on that line as well.
Okay. Can we move from local and national to the global context?
Sure.
You're a global company, and I'm wondering what kind of regulatory best practices you've seen in your global experience that would help Canada as we move into more renewable energy.
Well, Canada is one of the more progressive countries around the globe, and we've dealt with many different regulatory regimes. Europe is very mature, and what we're seeing now is transnational cooperation reinforced by the EU Commission.
Okay.
South Africa and Chile are developing their local policies and plans. So, for example, in South Africa, there's a renewable energy feed-in tariff process that's being developed there. But Canada, I'd have to say, is very progressive and is one of the international leaders in this whole field.
Mm-hmm. The Green Energy Act has been very progressive. Can we move now to technical challenges with renewable energy? The big issue, as I understand it, is the variability of wind resources. That's not such a concern with solar, but I've also heard that there's an issue with integrating renewables into the grid because of the variability. What can IT do to resolve this major hurdle?
There's a couple of key things. It's all about digitizing decision making. Capturing the regulatory framework, the policies and the process, and automating those. So the rule set is digitized, the decision making automated. That's the strategic intent. In specific terms, the variability of wind is overcome by considering the way to develop a portfolio effect. So in Europe, a lot of focus is going into this in Northern Europe. 10 countries, 9 from the EU and Norway, which is outside the EU, together have formed a memorandum of understanding to develop offshore wind in Europe. So it's a very illustrative example. Now, people talk about smart grid and talk about super grid, and what's the difference? Generally speaking, the smart grid is really looking at the consumer out. So how does the consumer manage their energy footprint effectively, and how do you maybe down the line introduce choice with supply for different tariff regimes, etc., that the consumer can select. Supergrid is different. Supergrid is about making that portfolio effect a reality. So variability of wind, absolutely. Typically a wind farm might have 40% operation in a calendar year, the wind blowing 40% of the time. But if you connect up wind farms that are geographically dispersed into a single energized bus bar, the supergrid, you mitigate that local effect and you smooth it out, and you might get 60% or more availability off that supergrid. But to do that, in Europe's case, you need to create a new regulatory framework, new technology, and buy-in. And for that reason, our CEO, Dr. Eddie O'Connor, has formed a consortium which now has its own CEO, Anna Aguado, a consortium called Friends of the Supergrid, to drive those standards and policies.
And on a technological level, I understand there's some private sector development companies like GE, for example, that are working on controllers to integrate renewables into the grid. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, the big 5 wind turbine manufacturers all have strategies in that regard. I mean, they are well aware of that. But there's also, you know, beyond the turbine itself, there's the electrical switchgear and connecting equipment. But we're seeing digitization right across that whole product set.
My last question has to do with the SICT framework that was announced today by IVI. And I'm interested in smart grid or supergrid implementations. How do you deal with the problem with the cultural divide that often occurs between utility companies and ICT companies that are looking for open standards, communication networks to manage the utility grid? There's a bit of a divide between those two groups. One is proprietary, one is open source.
Sure.
And so I'm just wondering if a tool like the SICT framework would help you bridge that divide.
I think so. There's really 2 dimensions to it. There are emerging standards, IEC standards, ANSI IEC standards, pertaining to renewable energy. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Germany, hosted by E.ON, big German utility company, and this was the hot topic. This was what we were there to talk about. And one extraordinarily innovative company, OSIsoft, has been a real pace setter there, and they've implemented their technology at E.ON in compliance with IEC 61400 and IEC 61850, which are 2 standards that pertain exactly in this area. So we are seeing the industry, you know, converge around agreed norms. You know, the communications protocols, the data transfer mechanisms, etc., captured in those IEC standards. And this is where ICT and the traditional utilities are coming together to drive this on. So we're seeing that, and as a company developing and constructing and operating wind farms, we're right in the middle of that, and it's important that we see the value that we can bring to that debate. From an SICT perspective, this is very much around the business processes and the bigger question within an organisation. But it does all marry up. I mean, the great thing about the approach IVI have taken is that it's not in conflict with other frameworks or standards or bodies. So although IVI looks at CMMI, for example, and looks at ITSMF and other frameworks, we don't see them as necessarily competitors. We see them as integratable into the overall framework. And similarly with SICT, when we're looking at standards in that regard to build wind farms sustainably, and you get into the debate as your question relates to, that there are solutions there, and it's a case of bringing people together. So some of the organisations will join IVI, others won't, others will remain interested from outside. But altogether, it's an exciting time. There's nothing but upside with all of this.
I agree 100%. John, thanks so much for your insight. I appreciate it.